Remember when Brian Griffin died? Of course you do. It was in the title of this video. Even if you had forgotten, that would have reminded you. The reason I ask is because there are times where I just forget it happened. Which is strange, because Family Guy killing off Brian seemed like such a big deal at the time, with all the media coverage it got and the massive fan outcry it received. But looking back now, Brian's death was such an insular event, only lasting 3 episodes, that sometimes it just completely slips my mind. Like, they'll make some casual reference to Brian's temporary death in a new episode, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that's totally a thing that happened. So obviously the only way to stop myself from forgetting about Brian's death is to make a video about it, then it'll be lodged in my brain forever. In this video, I'll be reviewing Life of Brian, the episode where Brian dies, as well as Christmas Guy, the episode where Brian is resurrected. Just like Jesus! Jesus was resurrected at Christmas, right? Throughout my review, there are 3 main questions I want to address. 1. How is Brian's death telegraphed? Does it have a satisfying setup and payoff? 2. What impact did it have on the show? Did it shake things up? And number 3, last but not least, were the episodes any good? Starting with Life of Brian, what sticks out to me when watching this episode, other than it being the one where Brian dies, is the way it's plotted. Life of Brian is clearly segmented into 3 separate parts, starting with the Native American alternate timeline adventure in Act 1, going on to Brian's death in Act 2, and spending Act 3 establishing the Griffin's new dog, Vinny. Whilst each of these concepts probably could have been spun into their own separate episodes, there is a thematic tie between the 3 acts that helps the episode to feel like a coherent story. For example, the alternate timeline in Act 1 might seem like it was just an excuse to make a bunch of tired jokes about Native American stereotypes, because it is. But starting the episode with a time travel misadventure was necessary in order to establish Stewie's motivations for destroying his time machine. Act 1's misadventure is also reminiscent of Family Guy's series staple Road 2 episodes, which are episodes centred on Brian and Stewie taking a road trip. Since this episode contains Brian's death, then theoretically he and Stewie wouldn't be able to do another Road 2 episode together. So this opening adventure is basically giving both Stewie and the audience one last hurrah with Brian before he is, supposedly, gone forever. Brian also draws attention to this status quo change when he comments that the time machine being destroyed is like the end of an era. This moment is filled with dramatic irony, as the sentimentality Brian feels over the time machine's destruction, while Stewie remains indifferent, will be completely inversed when Brian himself dies and Stewie is overcome with grief. Despite some mild foreshadowing, Brian's death is still a jarring plot turn, but that was intentionally so. The audience are as caught off guard by the gruesome death as the characters are. There's also this complete tonal whiplash as Brian's death is played straight, while still shoving in as many forced jokes as possible. Like, Brian getting hit by a car would be a very dramatic cliffhanger to end Act 1 on, but this is Family Guy, so we have to finish the act on a joke. So all the tension of the scene is completely undercut by having some random talking squirrel come out of nowhere to spit on Brian's mangled body. I don't think I can completely hold this against the episode though. Family Guy is a comedy, so I understand why they felt the need to pepper in these jokes. And I'll even admit, the fact these jokes clash so much against the melodramatic story makes them seem funnier to me than they would do otherwise. In fact, I think rewatching this episode in retrospect, knowing that Brian's death will be undone 2 episodes later, even makes the scenes of Brian dying morbidly hilarious to me. Like they're trying so hard to sell this scene, with the dramatic zoom-ins of the family crying and Brian's mangled corpse, and I am just cracking up knowing this is all one big charade. Brian's funeral is filled with cameos from his past, with characters like Gillian, Jasper and Ida all in attendance. And look, Cleveland and Donna even travelled down from Virginia for the funeral. But little did they know that the next funeral they would be attending would be for their own show.
It's too soon! Why, God? Why?
When watching Brian's funeral, I like to think that all of Brian's crying mourners represent the first-time viewers, who think that Brian is gone forever, whilst Quagmire represents everyone that knows this death is complete bullshit. Also, off topic, but another moment that hits different when watching now is this ominous line from Adam West.
None of you people came to my funeral!
So, Brian's death, but there's still 1/3 of the episode left to fill. And what does literally every TV show do when a main character gets killed off? Why, instantly replace them, of course! The decision to add a new character does make sense though. With Brian gone, it was necessary to bring in someone else for Stewie to confide in. It's just a little awkward seeing Stewie try to have a conversation with his family, when none of them can understand him. Well, except Chris, I guess. To fill the void Brian left, the family adopt Vinny, who, like Brian, is also a dog, except this one's like Italian or something? I don't know. I do appreciate that Vinny's not just a carbon copy of Brian, with their personalities greatly differing. Brian being this faux intellectual type, whilst Vinny is this Italian-American tough guy. He's not the most original character in the world, but Tony Sicaro's voice acting does help to bring some authenticity to the role. When the family adopt Vinny, he initially bonds with Peter, while Stewie hates the new dog. This is reminiscent of the dynamics of the early episodes, where Brian was portrayed as Peter's best friend, whilst Brian and Stewie constantly argued. Vinny and Stewie eventually warm to each other when Vinny reveals he is also mourning the death of someone close to him, a mutual sense of loss being the most natural way to get these two characters to bond. I think the sincerity of Vinny comforting Stewie holds up better than the Brian death scenes, mainly because this scene is just focusing on giving Vinny an empathetic backstory, instead of trying to shove a fake-out death down our throats. This ending still does suffer from having those tone-clashing jokes though, mainly that one about Vinny's former owner dying from a split ballsack. But I don't mind this joke as much as that squirrel joke interrupting Brian's death, since the stakes here are nowhere near as intense. And so, a new status quo for the series was set, as Stewie comes to terms with Brian's death and accepts Vinny as the new family dog. But the fans were nowhere near as receptive. Within seconds of the episode airing, there was a slew of Twitter hashtags, petitions, memes and fan art, all mourning Brian and demanding that he be brought back. There was even one picture floating around of someone with a RIP Brian tattoo, although I'm really hoping this picture was faked to Photoshop or something. When Family Guy executive producer Steve Callaghan was asked if he was worried about fan backlash over Brian's death, in an interview with E, he responded that fans should trust the staff as they always make choices that work to the greatest benefit of the series. This was basically all that could be said to reassure fans, while still trying to remain ambiguous about whether or not Brian's death was permanent. But there were some cracks in the facade that made Brian's eventual return pretty obvious. One being that back in October of that year, Entertainment Weekly had reported on an as of yet unaired Family Guy episode where Brian would fall for a runner voiced by Maya Rudolph. This would turn out to be the season 13 episode, Book of Joe. As well as that, two other future episodes titled Brian's a Bad Father and Brian the Closer had also been copyrighted, implying that Brian would be featured in those episodes. Unless of course the show added a different character called Brian, which would have been a funny twist actually, they should have done that. The staff did show some restraint by waiting 2 whole episodes before Brian returned. I'm going to brush over In Harmony's Way, the episode that aired between Life of Brian and Christmas Guy, because as Steve Callaghan said himself, it's just a run-of-the-mill episode. Unless you want to hear Seth MacFarlane do a duet with himself, in which case In Harmony's Way is the episode for you. So let's skip straight to Brian's return episode, Christmas Guy, although Brian himself isn't actually mentioned until the 11-minute mark, as the episode follows the typical Family Guy trend of not actually starting its plot until halfway through the episode. See, Family Guy is pretty infamous for not caring about typical plot structure, as the episodes tend to focus on making a series of gags rather than a satisfying narrative. This often leads to the first act being spent on riffing on a specific topic, be it motorcycles, moustaches, or guys named Justin. Once they've exhausted the gags, they'll drop the subject entirely and move on to something that bears little to no relation for the rest of the episode. Family Guy has even joked about this trend themselves in their more meta episodes.
We just happen to have a whole extra script right here. Pete, don't fail me now.
Sounds like I might be a teacher. Oh, I have a goatee up till the first commercial, and then I'm a teacher.
Christmas Guy is one of the episodes to follow this trend. The first half of the episode focuses on Peter trying to give Carter the Christmas spirit, which has almost nothing to do with Stewie attempting to save Brian's life in the second half, except for the Christmas theme, I guess. Really, any forward momentum the episode has just grinds to a halt during the Peter and Carter interactions. None of these scenes actually matter, because none of Peter's attempts do anything to change Carter's mind about Christmas, until Peter eventually plays on Carter's anti-Semitic insecurities. But in these situations, it's not really about moving the plot forward, it's more about the gags themselves. And I'd say they range from pretty weird to weirdly disturbing. The most meaningful thing the first act does is set up Stewie's angst, so there's some payoff when it's revealed that this angst is due to him missing Brian. Stewie suddenly crying over Brian is still kind of an abrupt shift, but that seems to be intentional. The staff really didn't want the public to know that this episode contained Brian's return, to the point that cast members allegedly had to resort to misleading their own family members about it. The next act starts with Vinny trying to cheer Stewie up, which leads to the most Vinny and Stewie interactions we've gotten so far. The two never achieve the same great on-screen chemistry that Stewie had with Brian, but it's not like they were trying to replicate that same dynamic between them anyway. With Brian, Stewie had more of a back-and-forth banter, whilst with Vinny, Stewie is more just the setup guy for Vinny's tough guy Italian-American jokes. I think these dynamics being different does help to justify Vinny replacing Brian for a few episodes. But while they do get a few decent gags out of Vinny, by the end of the episode I found his shtick was starting to grate on me, so I didn't really care when the episode retconned him out of existence. Vinny does make a cameo in the later episode, Red Shirt Blue Shirt, and if you want to hear Seth MacFarlane sing a duet with himself, then is Red Shirt Blue Shirt the episode for you. But now, for the real draw of the episode. How was Brian brought back to life, without it feeling like a complete arsepool? Well, in a move that left me genuinely surprised, they pulled off an incredibly subtle use of foreshadowing. And the best part is that they delivered the foreshadowing in the most Family Guy way possible, by having it be hidden in a cutaway gag. See, in Life of Brian, Stewie mentions that he time travelled forward to Christmas, which sets up this cutaway gag.
Wow, good timing, little fella. This just came out today.
Yeah, I kind of knew that already.
Would you like to donate an extra $1 to the Quahog Food Bank?
Oh, sure. And would you like to come home and clean my toilet while we're both doing stuff for each other?
It's not until 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, that this is revealed to be a major plot point, as Stewie sees his past self shopping for a Christmas present, and steals his time machine to save Brian's life. Family Guy usually uses cutaways for brief non sequitur jokes that have no bearing on the plot whatsoever, so pretty much no fan would expect this one cutaway gag about Stewie buying a Christmas present to actually be an important plot point. This one joke manages to highlight how the ending of Brian's death arc was always planned out, to the point that the writers even left a subtle hint for the audience to follow. And so, with Brian's life saved, the final scene has Stewie and Brian opening Christmas presents together. Brian looks lovingly into Stewie's eyes, while Stewie, who remembers nothing, is creeped out and confused over why Brian is being so sentimental. Kind of like how I was left confused over why the show tried to be so sentimental over Brian's death, only to undo it 2 episodes later. Whilst they've referenced Brian's death in a couple of episodes since, usually with jokes that make fun of the audience's reaction to it, Seth MacFarlane has gone on record to say that they won't kill Brian off again, although they actually did have Brian shot to death in the episode Nanny Goats, and then just had him alive and well again at the end of the episode with no explanation. Maybe that's what they should have done in Life of Brian. In the same panel, MacFarlane stated that Brian's death did what it was designed to do, remind people that this is a show where anything can happen. And yeah, the episodes certainly do that. This is a show where they will kill off one of their main characters in the most melodramatic way possible, only to be like, psych, he's fine, and then poke fun of the audience for caring about said death. Or they'll make some throwaway gag about the human baby thinking his pet dog got him pregnant, only to later do an episode where the human baby tricks the dog into getting him pregnant. It's only slightly less bad than it sounds. There's still some limit to what the show can do. It does eventually have to revert back to its status quo, but during that 22-minute journey, before everything reverts back to normal, yeah, it will take you wherever it feels like. I think Toonrific Tariq explains this best at the end of his review of Brian Wallow's Peter Swallows.
The way the writers tackle this show is really freeform. A character can say a line to another and never bring it up again, and still have a happy ending. I think Family Guy tells us exactly what it is at the start of every season or episode, and we get conflicted because A, it doesn't follow normal storytelling conventions, stuff that normally creates the best entertainment out, sort of like the reason why Matt and Trey hate the show. Family Guy's function, right, isn't to tell a story, at least not anymore. The story is like the backdrop. These characters are around to put on a show, to kind of do whatever and throw whatever at the wall and see what sticks.
I think a consequence of the show being so freeform and throwing everything at the wall, as Tariq puts it, is that sometimes the show is going to mess around with its audience's expectations, to the point that it might just feel disrespectful. But if you can enjoy a show that is willing to sucker punch you at any given moment, then maybe you'll get a kick out of Family Guy. And after all, isn't that the true meaning of Christmas?
And we don't know how to end these shows anymore, so we just do nonsense.